The battlefield was eerily silent. Smoke curled lazily into the sky from the charred remains of vehicles and weapons scattered across the blood-soaked ground. Bodies of soldiers, both human and alien, lay motionless, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. The once vibrant land had become a graveyard for the fallen. Jack Carter, a human medic, moved cautiously through the wreckage. His boots crunched against the debris as he scanned for any signs of life. His mission was simple: find survivors. But after hours of searching, hope was beginning to fade. The war between humanity and the alien race known as the Valyrian had been brutal, and the aftermath of this battle was proof of its mercilessness. Jack paused when he heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. He followed the noise, weaving through the ruins until he saw her. Lying amidst the rubble was a young woman with pale blue skin and long white hair matted with blood. Her armor was cracked and smeared with dirt, and deep wounds covered her body. Even in her battered state, there was an aura of strength and regality about her. She was unmistakably Valyrian, but different. He knelt beside her, his trained eyes quickly assessing the severity of her injuries. She was barely breathing, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored gasps. Blood seeped from a gash in her side, and her left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Jack hesitated, his mind racing. She was the enemy, part of the force that had caused so much pain to his people. But she was also a person, a living being fighting for life. He couldn't just leave her. "Hang on," Jack murmured, more to himself than to her. He pulled his medical kit from his bag, his hands moving swiftly to stop the bleeding. As he worked, the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were a piercing shade of silver, filled with a mix of confusion and fear. Her lips moved as if trying to speak, but no words came out. "It's okay," Jack said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's gaze fixed on him, and for a moment she looked ready to strike. But her body betrayed her, too weak to move. Her expression softened just slightly, and she allowed Jack to continue. He applied a pressure bandage to her side, knowing it was only a temporary fix. She needed proper treatment, and fast. Jack glanced around, his heart pounding. The area wasn't safe. Enemy patrols could return at any moment, and if they found him aiding a Valyrian, he'd be as good as dead. Still, he couldn't abandon her. Slinging his bag over his shoulder, he gently lifted the woman into his arms. She groaned in pain, her head lolling against his chest, but she didn't resist. "Stay with me," Jack urged as he started moving. His steps were quick but careful, each one echoing in the silence of the battlefield. The weight of the woman was significant, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He had to get her to safety before it was too late. As Jack carried her, he couldn't help but wonder who she was. She wasn't just any soldier. Her intricate armor and commanding presence hinted at someone of importance. He shook the thought from his mind. It didn't matter who she was. What mattered was keeping her alive. The trees of a nearby forest came into view, offering a glimmer of hope. If he could reach the cover of the woods, they might have a chance. The woman stirred again, her silver eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was a flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps. Before her eyelids drooped shut once more, Jack pressed on, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He had saved her, but at what cost? The forest was dark and quiet, the tall trees standing like silent guardians. Jack Carter pushed through the thick undergrowth, carrying the wounded Valyrian woman in his arms. His breaths came in sharp gasps, his muscles screaming from the effort. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every second spent out in the open was a second closer to danger. The woman stirred again, her silver eyes flickering open for brief moments. Her gaze landed on Jack, and a faint crease formed on her brow. She tried to move, but her body failed her, too weak and battered from the battle. "Don't try to move," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "You'll make it worse." She muttered something in her language, the words foreign and musical, but Jack couldn't understand them. Her tone, however, was unmistakable. She was questioning him, probably wondering why a human was carrying her instead of leaving her to die. Jack didn't have the energy to explain. Instead, he tightened his grip on her and kept moving. Finally, he reached a hidden clearing deep within the forest. Nestled against a rocky outcrop was a small, camouflaged shelter, a temporary medical station he had set up for emergencies. Jack eased the woman onto a makeshift bed inside the shelter, careful not to jostle her injuries. She winced, her sharp intake of breath breaking the heavy silence. Jack knelt beside her, pulling supplies from his bag. "This is going to hurt," he warned, holding up a sterilized tool to clean her wounds. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack thought she might lash out. But then she nodded, just barely, and turned her head away. Jack worked quickly, his hand steady despite the pressure. Her wounds were severe, and the fact that she was still alive amazed him. The cut along her side was deep, but not fatal if treated properly. The broken arm was another challenge, and he improvised a splint using supplies from his kit. Throughout it all, she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line to suppress any sounds of pain. "Who are you?" Jack muttered as he secured the last bandage. He sat back on his heels, studying her face. Even with her pale blue skin bruised and her white hair tangled, there was an undeniable air of authority about her. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone important, someone dangerous. The woman opened her eyes again, locking them with his. For a moment, Jack felt as if she was peering straight into his soul. Then she spoke, her voice soft but commanding. "Rayla." Jack blinked. "Rayla, is that your name?" She gave a weak nod, her gaze never leaving his. Jack frowned, trying to decide if he should give her his name in return. Finally, he sighed. "Jack, I'm Jack." Rayla didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted. Was that trust? Or maybe just curiosity? Jack couldn't tell. He shook his head and leaned back against the wall of the shelter, exhaustion creeping over him. "You're lucky I found you," he said, more to himself than to her. "This war doesn't leave much room for kindness." Rayla's lips twitched, almost as if she wanted to say something, but she closed her eyes instead. Jack watched her for a moment longer before standing and stepping outside. The forest was quiet, but Jack knew the peace wouldn't last. The battlefield wasn't far, and it wouldn't be long before someone came looking for survivors, human or Valyrian. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced back at the shelter. Saving her had been a risk, a big one, but something about her had made him act without thinking. Now, all he could do was hope it wouldn't get them both killed. The quiet of the forest was deceptive. Jack Carter could feel it, the unease that crept in with the silence. It wasn't just the aftermath of war, it was the sense that they weren't alone. He stood outside the shelter, scanning the trees for movement. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. If anyone came looking for Rayla, he needed to be ready. Inside the shelter, Rayla stirred, her breathing still shallow but steadier than before. Jack stepped back in, his boots brushing against the packed dirt floor. He crouched beside her, studying her pale blue face. She looked fragile, almost peaceful, but he knew better. Beneath that bruised exterior was a warrior, a queen, if her commanding aura meant anything. "You're going to be okay," he murmured, not sure if he was reassuring her or himself. He reached for his canteen, uncapped it, and held it to her lips. "Drink." Rayla's silver eyes opened slowly, narrowing as they focused on him. For a moment, she hesitated, then allowed him to tilt the canteen. The water trickled down her throat, and she let out a faint sigh, her gaze softening ever so slightly. Jack leaned back, resting on his haunches. "You're not like the others," he said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "I've seen Valyrian soldiers before. Cold, ruthless. But you're different." Rayla's lips moved, her voice a whisper. "I'd lead." Jack frowned, leaning closer. "You're a leader. A commander." She nodded weakly, her eyes closing again. Queen. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. Jack's breath hitched as the realization sank in. He wasn't just helping an enemy soldier. He was helping their queen. The same queen who had likely ordered countless attacks on his people. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears, but he pushed them aside. Right now, she was a wounded woman who needed help. The rest could wait. "Well, Your Majesty," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm despite himself. "Looks like you owe your life to a lowly human medic." Rayla's lips twitched in what might have been a smirk, but the moment passed quickly. She shifted slightly, wincing as pain flared through her body. Jack moved to adjust the splint on her arm, his hands careful but efficient. "You're healing," he said, mostly to reassure her. "Slowly, but it's happening. You just need rest." Rayla opened her eyes again, watching him intently. "Why?" "Help." Jack paused, the question catching him off guard. Why was he helping her? She was the enemy, a leader of the very forces that had caused so much suffering. Yet, when he found her on that battlefield, broken and abandoned, he hadn't been able to walk away. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "I don't care who you are or what side you're on. If I see someone dying, I help. That's just who I am." Rayla didn't respond, but the look in her eyes changed. There was no mistrust now, only a quiet curiosity. She seemed to be studying him, trying to understand this strange human who had risked his life for her. A rustling sound outside the shelter snapped Jack's attention back to the present. He grabbed his rifle, his body tense as he moved to the entrance. The forest was still again, but his instincts screamed at him to stay alert. "We might have company," he muttered, glancing back at Rayla. "Stay quiet." He peered out into the trees, his grip on the rifle tightening. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, he wasn't about to let them get to her. Not after everything he'd done to keep her alive. The quiet stretched on, broken only by the faint sound of Rayla's breathing behind him. Jack took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he prepared for whatever came next. The forest was still, but Jack Carter's instincts told him something was wrong. He crouched near the entrance of the shelter, his rifle steady in his hands. His eyes darted between the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. The faint rustling he had heard earlier had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Behind him, Rayla stirred, her voice weak. "What is it?" Jack didn't look back. "Don't know yet," he whispered. "Might be nothing. Might be someone tracking us. Either way, stay down." Rayla nodded faintly, her body too weak to move much anyway. Her silver eyes followed Jack's every move, and for the first time, she felt vulnerable, not just physically, but emotionally. She had always been the one leading, commanding. Now she was relying on a human, her sworn enemy, to keep her alive. It was a strange and uncomfortable feeling. Jack crept out of the shelter, keeping low as he moved into the dense undergrowth. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, but his grip was firm. He scanned the trees, his ears straining for any sound. A snapping twig made him spin, his finger on the trigger. "Easy there, mate," the voice called out, low and cautious. Jack's heart sank. Emerging from the shadows was a human soldier, dressed in combat gear and holding his own rifle. Jack recognized the insignia on the man's uniform, one of the scouting units sent to sweep the battlefield. But the look in the soldier's eyes told Jack everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a friendly visit. "Carter, right?" the soldier asked, stepping closer. "What are you doing all the way out here?" Jack straightened but kept his rifle lowered, his mind racing. "I'm looking for survivors. Same as you." The soldier's gaze flicked toward the shelter, suspicion creeping into his expression. "What did you find?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Jack said firmly. "Just debris and a lot of bodies." The soldier's lips curled into a smirk. "Funny. We got intel saying there might be a high-value target out here. Someone important. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. The soldier's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You always were a soft one, Carter, always putting principles over orders. So, I'll ask you one more time. What's in the shelter? Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. He knew this wasn't going to end well. The soldier wasn't here to help. He was here to kill. And if he found Rayla, her life would be over. Without thinking, Jack raised his rifle, aiming it directly at the soldier. You're not going in there. The soldier's eyes widened briefly before he chuckled. You're willing to risk your career, maybe even your life. For an enemy? That's rich. Walk away, Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. You don't need to do this. The soldier hesitated, his smirk returning. Suit yourself. Before Jack could react, the soldier lunged forward, knocking the rifle from his hands. The two men crashed to the ground, grappling in the dirt. Jack fought with everything he had, but the soldier was stronger, pinning him down. Just as the soldier raised his fist to strike, a blur of motion came from the shelter. Rayla, her movements unsteady but determined, appeared behind him. With a sharp piece of metal she'd found in the shelter, she struck the soldier's arm, forcing him to release Jack. The soldier cried out, stumbling back. Jack didn't waste a second. He grabbed his rifle, aimed, and shouted, "Don't move." The soldier froze, clutching his bleeding arm. Jack stood, his chest heaving, and glanced at Rayla. She was leaning against the doorway, her breathing labored but her silver eyes burning with defiance. "You saved me," Jack said, surprised. Rayla gave a faint, almost smug smile. "Now, we're even." The forest was alive with tension, the air thick and heavy after the skirmish. Jack Carter's heart pounded as he kept his rifle trained on the wounded soldier. The man, now sitting in the dirt and clutching his bleeding arm, glared up at Jack with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've lost it, Carter," the soldier spat. "Protecting her. An enemy. You'll get court-martialed for this." Jack ignored him, glancing back at Rayla, who stood weakly in the doorway of the shelter. Her pale blue skin was paler than usual, and her breaths came in shallow bursts, but her silver eyes were sharp and alert. She held her makeshift weapon tightly, the sharp edge still glinting with the soldier's blood. "She's not just an enemy," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "She's someone who needed help. You'd do the same if you weren't blinded by orders." The soldier scoffed, shaking his head. "You're a fool. When command hears about this, you're done." Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't have time for this. He stepped closer to the soldier, pressing the barrel of the rifle against his chest. "You're going to leave," he said quietly. "You didn't find anything here. Understand?" The soldier hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "And if I don't?" Jack's expression hardened. "Then I'll make sure you don't have the chance to report back." The soldier stared at him for a long moment before finally lowering his gaze. He nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine. I'll go." Jack gestured with his rifle. "Move." The soldier got to his feet, stumbling slightly as he cradled his injured arm. He shot one last venomous look at Jack before turning and disappearing into the forest. Jack listened carefully until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. Letting out a shaky breath, Jack lowered his rifle and turned back to Rayla. She was leaning heavily against the doorframe, her strength clearly fading. Jack rushed to her side, steadying her before she could collapse. "You shouldn't have come out," he said, his tone scolding but concerned. "You're not strong enough for this yet." Rayla's lips twitched in a faint smile. "You needed help." Jack shook his head, a small, incredulous laugh escaping him. "Yeah, well, next time. Let me handle it. You're supposed to be resting." He guided her back inside the shelter, helping her sit on the makeshift bed. She winced as she shifted, but her expression remained calm, almost amused. Jack knelt beside her, checking her bandages to make sure the effort hadn't reopened any wounds. "You're reckless, you know that," Jack muttered, more to himself than to her. Rayla tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes watching him intently. Reckless, like you. Jack looked up, caught off guard by her words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension from earlier had melted away, replaced by a quiet understanding. Despite everything, the war, the mistrust, the pain, they had saved each other. And that meant something. Jack broke the silence with a sigh. "We need to move soon," he said. "That guy's going to report back eventually. If they come looking, this place won't stay safe for long." Rayla nodded, her expression turning serious. "Where will we go?" Jack hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. The war zone wasn't exactly full of safe havens, especially for a Valyrian queen and a human medic who had just defied orders. But he couldn't let her stay here. He wouldn't. "I'll figure it out," he said finally. "For now, just focus on getting your strength back. We'll make it through this. Somehow." Rayla studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "I trust you." The words, simple as they were, struck Jack deeply. He swallowed hard and nodded back. "Good, because I'm not letting you down." Outside, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening as night approached. Jack's resolve only hardened. They were in this together now, and he would do whatever it took to keep them both alive. The forest was shrouded in darkness, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Jack Carter sat near the entrance of the shelter, his rifle resting across his lap. His eyes scanned the shadows, alert for any signs of movement. Rayla was inside, resting as best she could, though Jack knew she was far from healed. He leaned his head back against the rough wooden frame of the shelter, exhaustion pulling at him. It had been days since he'd slept properly, and the weight of their situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. He was protecting a Valyrian queen, a woman whose people were at war with his own, and the enemies weren't just out there in the forest. If his own side found out, they'd consider him a traitor. Jack sighed, his gaze flicking to the stars visible through the gaps in the trees. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" he muttered under his breath. From inside the shelter, Rayla's voice broke the quiet. "You doubt your choice." Jack turned, surprised to find her awake. She was sitting up, leaning against the wall, her silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. Her pale blue skin looked less ghostly now, and though her wounds still limited her, there was a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. He shook his head, forcing a small smile. "No, I don't regret it. I just..." He paused, searching for the right words. "This isn't exactly the kind of situation they prepare you for in training." Rayla tilted her head, her gaze steady. "You act from your heart. That is rare." Jack blinked at her, caught off guard. "I don't know about that. I think it's just survival instinct at this point." She gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "In my world, survival means strength, power. But you show kindness. It is strange." Jack chuckled softly. "Strange, huh? I'll take that as a compliment." For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jack could see the questions in her eyes, the curiosity that had been growing since the moment he saved her. He had questions of his own, but he wasn't sure if he'd get answers. "Why were you left behind?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "You said you're a queen. Shouldn't your people have protected you?" Rayla's expression darkened, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Betrayal," she said softly. "My own counsel. They feared my strength, feared my vision for peace." Jack frowned, leaning forward. "Peace? I thought your people were the ones who started this war." She looked up, her silver eyes blazing. "No, it was never my choice. I fought to protect my people. But the warlords wanted more. Conquest. Glory. I'd wanted something else." Jack sat back, the weight of her words sinking in. "So they turned on you." Rayla nodded. "They left me to die, a symbol of weakness, they said. But I will not give them that victory. Her determination struck a chord in Jack. Despite everything she'd endured, she wasn't giving up. He admired that, even if it complicated things. Well, he said, you're not dying on my watch. We'll figure this out. Together. Rayla studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. Together. The faint sound of movement in the forest snapped Jack back to the present. His body tensed as he grabbed his rifle and moved to the shelter's entrance. The shadows seemed to shift, and his pulse quickened. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't going to make this easy. Stay inside, he whispered to Rayla without looking back. As the sound grew louder, Jack steadied his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The forest felt alive with tension, every shadow and sound magnified in the stillness. Jack Carter crouched near the entrance of the shelter, his rifle aimed at the darkened trees. The faint rustling he'd heard earlier was now louder, deliberate. Someone, or something, was closing in. Behind him, Rayla sat quietly, her pale blue skin catching the dim light from the small lantern inside the shelter. Though still weak, her eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness as if she could sense the approaching danger. She clutched the sharp piece of metal she had used earlier, her determination clear despite her fragile state. Jack held up a hand, signaling her to stay back. His heart raced, his mind calculating every possible scenario. He had faced enemies before, but this was different. If it was a patrol, they wouldn't just be here for him. They'd kill Rayla on sight. The rustling grew closer, and Jack tightened his grip on the rifle. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint moonlight. It was a man, dressed in combat gear similar to the soldier Jack had encountered earlier. The insignia on his shoulder marked him as part of the human army. Carter. The man hissed, his voice urgent but low. It's me. Don't shoot. Jack didn't lower his weapon. Name, he demanded. Wells. The man replied, his hands raised in a show of peace. I was sent to find you. They said you didn't check in. Jack's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. It could be a trap. Wells could be lying, or worse, leading others right to them. He didn't have the luxury of trust anymore. Why are you alone? Jack asked, his voice cold. Wells hesitated, glancing around nervously. There's no time to explain. They're coming. Valyrian forces. We need to move. Jack's gaze flicked to Rayla, who was watching the exchange intently. Her expression was unreadable, but her grip on the makeshift weapon tightened. She didn't trust Wells, and neither did Jack. How do I know you're telling the truth? Jack pressed. Wells took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because I'm risking my life being here. I know what you've got in there, Carter. The Queen. And if they find her, it's over. For her. For you. For everyone. Jack's stomach dropped. If Wells knew about Rayla, then others might know too. The risk was growing by the second. He glanced back at Rayla, who gave him a small nod, as if to say, it's your call. Fine, Jack said, lowering his rifle slightly but not letting his guard down. We'll move, but if you so much as blink wrong, I'll put you down. Wells nodded, his face grim. Fair enough. Jack turned to Rayla. Can you walk? She pushed herself to her feet, unsteady but determined. We'll manage. Jack moved quickly, packing what little supplies they had into a bag. He handed her a small piece of cloth to wrap her sharp weapon, ensuring she had something to defend herself. Then, with a final glance at the shelter, they stepped out into the forest. The night was darker now, the canopy above blotting out most of the moonlight. Jack led the way, his rifle at the ready, while Wells followed closely, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. Rayla brought up the rear, her breaths shallow but steady. As they moved, Jack's mind raced. If Wells was right, and Valyrian forces were nearby, they had to stay one step ahead. But part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that Wells wasn't telling him everything. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and yet he had no choice but to follow for now. The faint hum of engines in the distance froze them in their tracks. Rayla's eyes widened as she turned to Jack. "They're here." Jack tightened his grip on the rifle, his jaw set. "Then we keep moving. Fast." The chase had begun, and Jack knew there was no turning back now. The faint hum of engines grew louder, the sound cutting through the stillness of the forest like a blade. Jack Carter glanced over his shoulder at Rayla, who was struggling to keep up. Her pale blue skin glistened with sweat, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. She was pushing herself too hard, but there was no time to stop. "Stay close," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. His rifle was clutched tightly in his hands, ready for anything. Wells, moving just ahead, held up a hand to signal them to stop. He crouched low behind a fallen tree, his sharp eyes scanning the dark forest. "They're sweeping the area," he muttered, "probably using heat sensors. We need to mask our trail." Jack frowned. "How do you propose we do that?" Wells gestured toward a nearby stream, its faint trickle barely audible. "The water. If we stick to it, it might throw off their sensors. But we need to move now." Jack nodded and turned to Rayla. "Can you make it?" Rayla straightened, her silver eyes meeting his with determination. "I will. Try." Without wasting another second, they headed for the stream. The cold water bit at their legs as they waded in, but the sound of the engines growing closer left no room for hesitation. Jack kept his rifle raised, his finger hovering near the trigger. The forest was dense, but the Valyrian patrols wouldn't stop until they found what, or who, they were looking for. As they followed the stream, Rayla's steps faltered. Jack immediately moved to her side, steadying her with one arm. "Easy," he said softly. "Lean on me if you have to." She didn't protest, her pride taking a backseat to survival. Together, they pressed on, the cold water soaking through their boots and clothes. Wells kept glancing over his shoulder, his face tense. The hum of engines was now joined by distant voices, sharp and commanding. "They're splitting up," Wells said grimly. "Trying to flush us out." Jack's mind raced. He had been in situations like this before, but never with stakes so high. One wrong move could mean death, for him, for Rayla, and even for Wells, who was risking everything to help them. As they rounded a bend in the stream, the faint outline of a cave came into view. It was small and partially hidden by overgrown vines, but it might be enough to buy them some time. "There," Jack said, pointing. "Get inside." Wells nodded and ducked into the cave first, scanning it for threats. Jack followed, helping Rayla inside before pulling the vines back into place. The darkness of the cave swallowed them, the hum of engines now muffled but still too close for comfort. Rayla sank to the ground, her chest heaving, as she tried to catch her breath. Jack crouched beside her, his rifle still at the ready. "We'll rest for a minute," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Wells crouched near the entrance, his sharp eyes peering through a small gap in the vines. "They're close, real close." Jack tightened his grip on the rifle. "How many?" "Too many to fight," Wells replied grimly. "We stay quiet and hope they pass." The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Rayla leaned her head back against the cave wall, her silver eyes watching Jack. Despite the danger, she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You risk much for me." Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I told you. It's the right thing to do." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "And yet, you don't trust him." She nodded toward Wells. Jack didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't trust Wells entirely, but for now, they needed him. Trust could wait. Survival couldn't. Outside, the hum of engines began to fade. Wells let out a slow breath. "They're moving on. For now." Jack's jaw tightened. "Then we use this time to plan. They'll be back, and we need to be ready." Rayla's eyes gleamed in the darkness. We will fight. Together. Jack nodded, determination hardening in his gaze. Together. The cave remained silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. Jack Carter sat cross-legged near the entrance, his rifle resting on his lap. Wells was further back, sharpening his blade with deliberate strokes, while Rayla leaned against the rough stone wall, her strength slowly returning. The hum of engines was gone, but Jack knew it wouldn't be long before the patrol circled back. "We can't stay here forever," Jack said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, steady. "They'll search the area again, and this time they'll find us." Wells nodded, his expression grim. "We need to make a move before sunrise. If we can reach the ridge a few miles east, we might lose them in the valleys." Jack glanced at Rayla. Her silver eyes met his, calm but resolute. "Are you up for it?" he asked. She straightened, her pale blue skin still marked with healing wounds, but her determination shone through. "I can fight if needed," she said softly. "I will not slow us down." Jack gave a small nod. He had no doubt about her willpower. What worried him was the growing danger. The patrols were closing in, and the longer they stayed together, the higher the risk for all of them. Wells stood, sliding his blade back into its sheath. "We leave now. The ridge won't be easy, but it's our best shot." Without another word, the three of them slipped out of the cave and into the dense forest. The night was cold, and the damp earth muffled their footsteps. Jack took the lead, scanning the terrain with practiced precision. Rayla followed close behind, her movements quieter than he expected given her condition. Wells brought up the rear, his sharp eyes constantly checking for any signs of pursuit. The forest grew steeper as they climbed toward the ridge. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced with every step. Jack's heart pounded as they reached an open clearing, a dangerous stretch of exposed ground they couldn't avoid. "We move fast," Jack whispered. "No stopping until we're across." Rayla nodded, gripping her makeshift weapon tightly. Wells unslung his rifle, ready for anything. One by one, they darted across the clearing, their movements swift and silent. But just as they reached the other side, a sharp voice rang out behind them. "There! Stop them!" Jack's blood turned cold. He spun around, raising his rifle as figures emerged from the shadows. Valyrian soldiers, their armor glinting in the moonlight. They were fast, and they were closing in. "Go!" Jack shouted to Rayla. "Keep moving." But Rayla didn't run. Instead, she turned, her silver eyes blazing with defiance. With a cry that echoed through the forest, she charged at the nearest soldier, her makeshift blade catching the light as it slashed through the air. The soldier faltered, unprepared for the ferocity of her attack. Jack and Wells opened fire, their bullets cutting through the chaos. The Valyrian patrol scattered, but they didn't retreat. More soldiers emerged, their voices sharp as they barked orders. It was a fight they couldn't win, but Jack wasn't about to give up. Rayla fought with a grace and strength that seemed impossible given her injuries. Each movement was precise, calculated. She was a queen reclaiming her throne, even on a battlefield. Jack couldn't help but admire her courage, even as he fired shot after shot to protect her. "We're outnumbered," Wells shouted, his voice strained. "We need to fall back." Jack gritted his teeth. He knew Wells was right, but leaving meant exposing Rayla. He glanced at her, his decision made. "Rayla, go with Wells. I'll hold them off." "No," she shouted, her voice fierce. "I will not leave you." The determination in her voice struck Jack like a physical blow. She wasn't just a queen or a warrior. She was a survivor, and she wasn't going to abandon the man who had risked everything for her. Together, they fought, side by side, until the forest finally fell silent. The Valyrian patrol was gone, scattered or defeated. Jack lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, and looked at Rayla. She stood tall, her silver eyes unyielding. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. Rayla gave him a faint smile, her voice soft but firm. I did. We are. Together. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Together. It was a word that carried more weight now than ever before, and as they turned toward the ridge, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees, Jack felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it as one.